Unavailable. Need only allowed. My pressure gauge was almost empty. I kept looking at it like the numbers might change if I stared long enough. They didn't. The needle was down in the red, and my regulator was free-flowing against my teeth. Every breath came with a steady rush of air that I couldn't afford to lose. The water was black around me. My dive light made a narrow yellow patch through it. Blood drifted up from my left forearm. It came out in slow red strings and spread through the beam. My suit had been cut open from the wrist almost to the elbow. The wound underneath was deep enough that I could feel every pulse in it. I had no idea where Randy was. His guideline floated past my mask and disappeared into the dark behind me. It wasn't attached to anything anymore. The end of it had been cut clean. Not torn or pulled loose. Cut. I reached out and caught it. We'd been on shore a few minutes earlier, getting ready for what was supposed to be a simple afternoon dive. The sun was still up, but it had that weak October light to it, the kind that makes the trees look tired and doesn't warm anything. Blackwater Quarry always felt cold before you even got in. We checked the tanks and the reels, checked the lights and the backup lights, checked the pony bottles and the knives, and all the other things people tell you to check even when you've checked them 100 times before. Randy checked mine. I checked his. That's how we'd always done it. We started diving together when we were teenagers and never really stopped. We lived separate lives by then, separate houses, separate jobs, separate everything, more or less. But when we went underwater, we still moved like we were sharing one set of hands.
Everything look good?
Randy asked.
Looks good.
He gave me the okay sign. I gave it back. Randy had a way of making that sign look like a joke. He'd make the ring with his thumb and finger and hold it out like he was asking if I wanted to buy something. Then he'd nod at the water, as if the whole dive was no more complicated than taking out the trash. We went down the flooded limestone face, toward the old pump house. The top of the quarry was green and cloudy. Visibility wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either. My light showed me a few feet of rock and then gave up. We reached the pump house at about 40 feet and swam around the collapsed machinery. There were rusted pipes and a metal housing that had split open along one side. Catfish moved through the beams and vanished when our lights touched them. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing moved that shouldn't have moved. It was boring. I kept thinking about how boring it had been. A routine dive, a little cold, bad visibility, old machinery. The sort of thing you forget before you're back in the truck. Then Randy's light shifted. He was looking down the quarry wall. I followed his beam and saw the crack halfway between the pump house and the surface. At first I thought it was just another break in the limestone. The quarry wall was full of them. Most were shallow and packed with silt. This one went back. Broken stone framed a narrow opening, and the darkness behind it didn't look like the rest of the wall. It had depth to it. The passage seemed to widen once it got past the first few feet. Randy swung his light toward me. He pointed at the opening. Then he pointed at himself and made a swimming motion with 2 fingers. I shook my head. He held up both hands and spread them apart. Close. Then he pointed beyond the crack and widened his hands again. It looked bigger back there. That didn't mean it was safe. A hole can look big from the outside. So can a hole in the ice right before it closes over your head. I tapped my pressure gauge and shook my head again. Neither of us had enough gas for an unexplored overhead passage. That was the whole point of the gauge. It only told us how much air we had left and how far we could afford to go. Randy looked at the fissure. Then he looked back at me. He made the okay ring again, but this time he held it up beside the crack. He gave me the little nod that meant he knew exactly what I was saying and planned to ignore it. I reached for his arm. He was already feeding the guideline into the opening. The line slid over the broken limestone and vanished into the dark. I grabbed for his harness, but caught only the edge of a strap. Randy pushed himself forward, and his shoulders disappeared past the rock. I followed him. Neither of us entered an uncharted cave alone. Randy's guideline disappeared into the fissure as I followed it beneath the quarry wall. I pushed farther into the fissure, and the rock closed in around me. At first, there was room for both of us. Not much room, but enough that Randy could swim ahead and I could keep one hand on the guideline and one hand against the wall. The broken limestone scraped over my gloves and caught on my tank whenever I moved wrong. Then the passage narrowed. Randy went single file and I followed behind him. My light showed his fins kicking up little clouds of silt. The water had that stale cave smell to it, though I don't know how water can have a smell when you're breathing it through a regulator. Maybe it was the rock. Maybe it was the old mud sitting in the cracks. A dive fin lay upside down along the bottom. I stopped for half a second and aimed my light at it. It was an old one, black rubber, torn strap, covered in pale grit. Another fin rested farther ahead. Then I saw a wetsuit, still zipped shut, wedged between the wall and the floor. There wasn't anybody in it. The suit moved a little in the current, or what I thought was a current. One arm drifted up and settled back down. The zipper was closed all the way to the neck. There was no head inside the hood. A regulator floated past me on its hose. The mouthpiece was still intact. It turned slowly in front of my mask and disappeared behind my shoulder. Randy's light kept moving ahead, steady and calm. He had a way of looking at a bad situation and deciding it was only inconvenient. I pulled myself along the guideline and kept going. The passage got tighter. My tank valves scraped the ceiling, and I had to turn sideways to get through. Randy did the same ahead of me. The sound of our bubbles changed in the narrow space. They hit the rock and came back in bursts, loud enough that I could hear them through my hood. The far end of the passage was full of silt. It shifted before either of us reached it. I stopped moving. The silt rolled out from the dark in a slow gray sheet. I held my light on it and waited for something to come through. Randy's fins stopped ahead of me. His light stayed pointed forward. For a second, nothing happened. Then something pale unfolded from the ceiling. It came down in sections. I saw the shape first, long and flat against the rock, and then the limbs started opening underneath it. They didn't move like arms or legs. They folded in the wrong places and then reversed themselves as the thing lowered into the passage. There were too many of them. Its head came forward between the rocks. It was flat and wide like a shovel blade, pale as old bone. There were no eyes, no dark spots, nothing on the head at all that I could recognize as a face. I kept waiting for it to react to my light. It didn't. The thing moved between me and the mouth of the fissure. It crossed the passage without stirring the silt or touching the rock. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. I swung my light after it. One of the limbs came back. I felt the hit. The limb dragged across my left forearm and cut through the suit like it was cloth. There was no struggle, no warning. Just a hard, pulling pain, and then blood spreading through the beam. I kicked backward and hit the wall. The rock caught my tank and held me there for a moment. My light spun across the passage. The pale head was gone. The limbs were gone. There was only silt and the thin stream of bubbles pouring out in front of my mask. Randy's light went dark. I reached for him. My hand found the guideline first. It was running through the water between us, and then it wasn't. The loose end came into my fingers. I pulled it toward me and felt the line slide against my glove. It hadn't torn. A torn line would have been rough. The fibers would have pulled apart and caught on my glove. This end was smooth, slick. It looked like somebody had taken a knife to it. I pulled again. Nothing came back. I moved forward on the line, pushing through the silt, and found Randy for just long enough to see his mask. It was flooded. His face was behind the dark glass, but I couldn't make out his eyes. His regulator was gone. I don't know. I caught at his harness. My fingers caught nothing. The silt closed around him, and he disappeared beyond the cut line. I stayed there with the end of the guideline in my hand. The water was full of my blood. It came out in red threads and drifted past my mask. Seeing it brought the pale head back to me. The way it had moved, the way it had crossed the exit without even disturbing the water. I started to turn back toward the fissure mouth, then checked my pressure gauge. The needle was almost empty. I didn't have time to search the passage. Go! I found the wall with my hand and started feeling along it. My light beam was weak now, and the silt made it worse. Every few seconds I stopped and listened, though all I could hear was my own breathing and the rushing hiss of the regulator. Then I saw a glow. It was deeper in the passage and faint enough that I almost missed it. Randy's dive light had landed somewhere ahead. The beam was pointed into the rock, and only the edge of it showed through the silt. I could have gone back up through the quarry, following the wall through open water in a straight line to the surface and the pump house. But Randy was down there. I grabbed the guideline and pulled myself toward the light. The passage angled upward beyond the flooded section, and I followed the faint glow of Randy's dropped light toward it. Beyond the flooded section, the passage sloped up, and I went after the faint glow from Randy's dropped light. The ceiling rose a little at a time. My tank stopped scraping rock, and I was able to turn my shoulders without catching on everything. The water stayed cold, but the pressure in my ears eased as I climbed. I kept one hand on the wall and the other on the guideline, though the line was only useful if it still led somewhere. Randy's light had landed on a narrow shelf above the water. It was still burning, pointed across the chamber. I pulled myself up until my mask broke the surface. I came out under a limestone dome. The air pocket wasn't large. The ceiling curved up maybe 40 feet above the water, and the far wall ran along a dry shelf that was just wide enough to stand on. There was no wind, no echo from outside. The place felt sealed off from the quarry, and had probably been that way for a very long time. The only sound was water dripping from the rock. I took one breath through the regulator and nearly choked on it. The thing was still free-flowing, sending a steady stream of bubbles up past my face. I climbed onto the shelf and sat there for a second with my back against the wall. My left arm was bleeding again. The water had kept the wound from looking as bad as it felt, but up there I could see the red running down my glove. I swung my light across the shelf. There were wetsuits everywhere. Some were folded in piles along the wall. Others hung from pieces of rusted pipe or lay collapsed on the stone with the legs twisted together. Masks sat beside them. Fins were stacked in pairs. Weight belts had been left in loops, the buckles green with corrosion. There were tanks, too, most of them on their sides, with valves and hoses scattered around them. A few of the tanks looked newer than the rest. Not new exactly, but in better condition than the others. The oldest ones were short and wide with markings stamped into the metal. I recognized some of the names and numbers from old missing diver notices I'd seen in the Bedford newspaper. You'd see those notices every now and then. A photograph, a name, last seen at Blackwater Quarry. Sometimes they found a car or a set of keys. Sometimes they found nothing at all. I couldn't say which gear belonged to which diver. The shelf had been collecting it for decades. There were old rubber masks that looked like they belonged in a museum, and newer dive computers with their screens gone black. One regulator rested by itself near a pile of tanks. Its mouthpiece was still attached, but the second stage was cracked and the hose had stiffened with age. They'd gone into the cave and never come back out. Their equipment had stayed behind. Randy's light was somewhere below, but I couldn't search for it or work out how long the air pocket had been there. The water below the shelf moved. It was just a small shift at first, a dark ripple against the limestone, then another one farther out. I grabbed my light and shut it off. The chamber went black. I pushed myself behind a stack of old tanks and pulled my knees up as close as I could. The metal pressed into my back. One tank rolled a little when I touched it, and I caught it before it could make a sound. My regulator was still hissing. I pulled it out of my mouth and clamped the free-flowing second stage against my chest. The bubbles kept coming, but most of them broke against my suit instead of rushing straight to the surface. I held my injured arm against the limestone. The movement below the shelf stopped. I stayed still. That sounds simple. It isn't. My shoulder started to shake. My legs were already cramped from the swim, and my wounded arm throbbed against the rock. I kept thinking about scratching my nose, shifting my weight, taking a real breath. I didn't do any of it. Something rose out of the water. The creature came up beneath the shelf without making a splash. I could hear the water moving against the stone, but there was no sound from the thing itself. Its head broke the surface near the edge of the limestone. The light was off, so I only saw it because there was a little gray glow coming down from somewhere above. Maybe it was my eyes adjusting. Maybe there was another opening in the dome. It didn't matter. I saw enough. The head was pale and flat and shaped like a spade. It moved slowly along the front of the shelf. The mouth was the widest part of it, though mouth might not be the right word. It opened across the front like a flat seam and passed through the air a few inches below me. There were no eyes. I watched the head turn from one side to the other. The body below it came up in sections. Long, pale segments joined together wrong, each one folding and reversing before the next one moved. Limbs spread out beneath it and bent in ways that made my stomach tighten. It looked a little like a spider if a spider had been pulled apart and put back together by somebody who'd never seen one before. The creature paused. I could feel the vibration in the tanks behind me. It was faint. Maybe it was coming through the water. Maybe it was coming through the rock. The thing held there for several seconds with its flat head just above the surface. Then it sank. I waited until the last pale section disappeared and kept waiting after that. My regulator pressed against my chest. The air in my tank was running down, and I could feel the pressure getting weaker through the free flow. A minute later, the water moved again. It came back the same way, up beneath the shelf, head through the air, that flat mouth sliding along the edge, then down. I counted the patrols because counting was easier than thinking about Randy. 1, 2, 3. By the fourth time, my legs were cramping hard enough that I almost moved. The wound in my forearm had gone from sharp pain to a deep, pulsing ache. I could feel every beat of my heart in it. No light, no bubbles, no movement. The creature wasn't looking for me. It didn't seem to have eyes at all. It followed the light. It felt the vibration through the water and heard the bubbles. I stayed pressed behind the old tanks as the creature sank below the shelf and the chamber returned to darkness. I kept waiting after the water went still. My legs were cramped and my shoulder had started shaking, but I didn't move. The regulator lay against my chest and my injured arm was flat against the limestone. Every bubble felt like a mistake. Then I heard 3 taps. They came from the far end of the shelf. Metal on metal. 3 slow taps with the same space between each one. I knew that signal. Randy and I had used it for years. Underwater or in the dark or anywhere we couldn't talk. 3 taps meant one diver was present and safe. It wasn't an official signal. It wasn't something they taught in classes. We made it up when we were kids and kept using it because it worked. 3 taps meant I'm here. I didn't answer right away. The creature was still somewhere below me, and the chamber was quiet enough that I could hear water dripping from the ceiling. A drop landed near my glove. I felt the little splash through the rock. The metal tapped again, 3 times. Randy was alive. At least that's what I believed. I didn't have any other explanation that made sense. The light had been his. The line had been his. The signal was his. I knew the difference between Randy's tap and a random piece of equipment shifting around in the dark. I also knew Randy could be wrong about being safe. I took the regulator away from my chest and held it close to my mouth without biting down. The free flow hissed against my suit. I waited another few seconds and then leaned toward the darkness.
Randy?
My voice came out thin and rough. It didn't travel far. The chamber swallowed most of it. Something answered from the far end of the shelf. It was a rasping sound, not a word, more like somebody dragging a breath through a damaged throat. It came from nearby, but the rock made it hard to tell how nearby. The sound could have been 10 feet away or across the whole chamber. I heard it again. Randy needed help. I couldn't stay behind the tanks until my air ran out. I couldn't leave him there either. Randy would have crossed the shelf for me. He would have done it without making a big speech about it. He'd have looked at the dark and given me that little okay gesture, like the whole thing was only mildly inconvenient. So I started to move. I eased one knee away from my chest and waited. Nothing happened. I shifted the other leg, and the old tanks gave a soft metal creak behind me. I stopped again. The water beneath the shelf was black. I couldn't see the bottom. My light was still off, and I didn't want to turn it on. The creature followed light and vibration and bubbles. I didn't know which one of those mattered most, so I tried not to give it any. I crawled along the limestone with the regulator clutched against my chest. My tank scraped the rock when I turned sideways. The sound seemed loud enough to fill the entire chamber. I made it a few feet. Then the water below me started moving. It came up without a splash. The surface rose around something pale and long and folded wrong. The flat head broke through first. It lifted beneath the shelf and stopped just below the edge. I froze. The creature wasn't alone. Something trailed behind it in the water. I took it for another piece of equipment, a tank maybe. Then the thing rolled, and I saw the body inside the dry suit. The suit was new. The fabric was clean and dark. The seams weren't faded, and the boots didn't have the white crust that covered most of the gear on the shelf. A fresh mask still covered the diver's face. There was a regulator hanging loose against the chest. The creature dragged him by one leg. The diver's head bumped against the limestone once. The mask shifted, but stayed on. One hand moved through the water and came to rest against the shelf. The fingers were spread out. There was no movement after that. I watched the creature pull him closer. He couldn't have been down there long, not like the others. His gear hadn't had time to turn old or grow over with silt. He'd come into the cave recently, maybe only hours earlier. The creature had caught him and kept hunting after that. It had been waiting below me while I waited above it. The flat head rose until the front of it rested against the shelf. The mouth opened across its face. There was no noise, no growl, no breathing, nothing. It pulled the body onto the limestone. The dry suit dragged over the rock with a wet, scraping sound. The diver's tank caught on the edge and jerked his body sideways. The creature folded itself over him, and the limbs came up around the suit. They bent at the joints and pressed down in several places at once. I kept the regulator tucked against me. The free flow was getting weaker. I could feel the bubbles coming slower. Before, it had been a steady hiss. Now it came in uneven bursts. My air was running out, and there wasn't anything I could do about it without making noise. The creature started feeding. The mouth opened wider, and the front of the dry suit disappeared beneath that flat, pale head. The body moved under it. One boot kicked once against the stone, and then went still. I pressed my injured arm harder against the limestone to keep from shaking. I wanted to turn away. I didn't. The feeding took a long time, or it felt like it did. The creature stayed folded over the diver and worked at him in slow movements. The limbs kept shifting around the body. Every now and then the suit made a soft popping sound as something underneath it moved. I stayed behind the tanks and held my breath whenever the regulator hissed too loudly. My legs cramped again. My shoulder burned. The cut in my arm had started bleeding through the glove, and the blood ran down between my fingers. The tapping never came again. When the creature finally lifted its head, the dry suit was collapsed beneath it. The mask had come loose and lay on its side near the edge of the shelf. The creature slid backward into the water, folding itself down in sections. Its pale head disappeared first, then the limbs. The water closed over it, and the chamber went dark. I waited until I couldn't hear the water moving anymore. Then I took my hand off the limestone and reached into the dark. I didn't know exactly where Randy was. I knew he was at the wall where the tapping had come from. The shelf wasn't that big, but in the dark, it felt like the whole chamber had opened up between us. My light was still lying somewhere behind the tanks, and I wasn't going to turn it on. I used the wall to guide me. My fingers moved over wet limestone and then caught on a piece of loose gear. I felt around it and figured it was a weight belt. The buckle was cold and rough with corrosion. I moved past it and reached for the next thing. There was a tank on its side. I pushed it away from me, and it rolled a few inches before stopping against another one. The sound went through the chamber. I froze. Nothing came out of the water. No pale head, no limbs sliding up from below. I kept my hand on the tank and waited until my shoulder started shaking again. Then I crawled forward. I didn't go fast. You can't move fast in the dark on a limestone shelf with dive gear scattered all over it. Every inch of the way I had to feel ahead of me before I put my weight down. There were masks and hoses and tanks and pieces of equipment I couldn't identify. One of the hoses caught around my wrist, and I had to work it loose without pulling hard. The tapping came again. 3 slow hits. It was close now, maybe 10 feet away, maybe less. I reached the shelf's end and found the wall with both hands. The limestone curved inward there, and the scattered gear was piled against it. I felt along the pile, moving one piece at a time. A mask, a fin, something with a hard plastic case. Then my hand touched a shoulder. I knew it was Randy before I touched his face. His wetsuit was cold and stiff. I grabbed both his shoulders and pulled him toward me, expecting his body to give with the movement. It didn't. His back scraped along the wall and his head stayed where it was. The suit had been wedged into the equipment. I pulled harder. Randy came forward a few inches and then stopped. His body was rigid, no muscle moving under the suit, no hand reaching up to grab my arm. He was dead. I put my hand against the side of his neck, even though I already knew. His skin felt like the rock. I found his mask and ran my fingers over the frame. It was still in place, but the glass was clouded from the inside. I couldn't see his face. I didn't need to. Randy had drowned hours earlier. He'd been down here before I entered the fissure, before the creature got me in the arm, before I ever saw his light go out. The body in the new dry suit hadn't been him. Randy had been sitting in the dark by that wall while I crawled toward a sound he hadn't made. The thought didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, the way the gear was spread around us. I felt along his chest and found the harness. One strap had been pulled tight across him. Another piece of equipment was jammed against his hip. He was sitting upright among the old tanks, held in place by the harness and equipment. It hadn't just killed him, it had used him. My hand moved down Randy's right side and found the knife sheath. The knife was gone. I searched the shelf around his leg and felt metal pressed against a tank. The blade was out. The handle was trapped between the tank and the limestone, and the blade rested against the metal. I touched it with my fingers and felt the edge of it shift. 3 taps. The creature had struck the knife against the tank. I kept my hand on the blade and listened to the silence around me. We'd used that signal for years. 3 taps meant one diver was present and safe. It wasn't complicated. The creature didn't need to understand the words. It only needed to hear the pattern and learn what it brought me toward. It had listened to us. I didn't know how long it had been down there or how much it understood. I knew what it had done. It had made the sound and waited for me to cross the shelf. I pulled the knife free. The tank gave a soft scrape as the blade came loose. The water moved below me. I turned my head toward the edge of the shelf. I couldn't see anything. I could hear a low shifting sound under the limestone, like water being pushed aside by something too large to swim normally. The creature was coming back. I still had one hand on Randy's shoulder. I let go and started backing away. My knee struck a tank and it rolled against the one beside it. The two pieces of metal knocked together. The water rose beneath the shelf. I reached for my light and stopped myself. Light would bring it straight to me. I had already learned that much. No light, no bubbles, no movement. That was the rule, and it wasn't much of a rule because it left me with almost nothing I could do. I moved backward anyway. My heel caught on a loose hose. I pulled it free and felt the edge of another tag against my calf. Randy's body was behind me, and the dark water was in front of me. The creature's head broke the surface below the shelf. I saw the pale shape even without the light. It came up slowly. The flat head lifted through the water and turned toward the shelf. There were no eyes. There was nothing on that wide, pale face except the mouth opening and closing in a thin seam. It had found the disturbance. I looked down at the gear around me. My air was almost gone. The free-flowing regulator had slowed to an occasional hiss, and my lungs were beginning to tighten. I needed another tank, or I needed the passage. The passage was below the creature. Then I saw the pony bottle. It was clipped into the old gear beside Randy. Small tank, short hose. The metal was scratched and dull, but the valve looked usable. Randy carried it on long dives in case one of us had a problem. He'd offered it to me more than once, and I'd told him I wasn't going to need it. I reached for the valve. The creature lifted higher. One pale limb came over the edge and folded against the rock. I grabbed the pony bottle and tore it loose from the straps. The buckle struck the rock. The creature turned toward the sound. I didn't wait for it to climb onto the shelf. I shoved away from the wall and dropped into the water. The cold closed over my mask, and the creature's limbs moved above me. I kicked hard toward the flooded passage, with Randy's spare pony bottle in my hand. I kicked hard toward the flooded passage, gripping Randy's spare pony bottle. The water was black, and I couldn't see the opening, but I knew where it was. The quarry wall had been on my left when we came in. If I kept it there and followed the slope down, then I should reach the fissure. Should have, anyway. The creature moved somewhere behind me. I couldn't see it, but I felt the water change. A pressure wave hit my fins and pushed them forward. Then another one came from below and shook the loose hose in my hand. It was closing the distance. I kept my left hand on the wall and used my fingers to haul myself along. My right hand held the pony bottle tight against me. The tank bumped the limestone every time I kicked. I tried to keep it from making noise, but there wasn't much room to work with, and I was already moving as fast as I could. The main tank gave one last weak hiss. Then nothing. I sucked in and got a mouthful of cold water through the regulator. I clamped my teeth down and pulled the second stage out. The hose caught against my harness when I tried to disconnect it. I fumbled with the connection and felt the water shift behind me. Something struck the rock. The impact came through the wall and into my hand. Not a tap this time. A hard scrape followed by a heavy knock. The creature's limbs were hitting the passage behind me. I worked the connector loose. My fingers weren't doing what I wanted them to do. They felt thick inside the gloves, and I couldn't get a grip on the fitting. I pulled harder, and the regulator came free. The pony bottle had a short hose, and it wasn't made for switching in the dark while something was chasing you. Randy had always said it was simple enough. Clip it on, crack the valve, breathe from it. Simple things stop being simple when you can't see your hands. I found the valve and turned it open. Air rushed into the hose. I shoved the mouthpiece in and took a breath. The air tasted stale and metallic, but it was air. I took another one right away. The bottle worked. I didn't stop to see how much was in it. The creature hit the rock again. This time something scraped along the passage floor behind my legs. I kicked and pulled harder, dragging myself toward the fissure. My knees struck the limestone and my tank caught on a raised piece of stone. I twisted sideways and tore it loose. The water ahead felt different. The passage was getting wider. I could feel more space around my shoulders, and the wall no longer pressed against my arm the whole way. That was the direction. I remembered the jagged limestone and the narrow opening where Randy had gone in first. The fissure was close. I dragged myself over the bottom and found the crack with my hand. The opening was no more than a gap between two shelves of rock. It looked big enough when we came through because we were moving forward and there was no creature behind us. Now it looked too small for anything. I kept the pony bottle pinned against me and turned my shoulders. My tank scraped along one side of the fissure. The limestone caught the edge of my harness and held me there. I kicked. Nothing. The creature struck the rock behind me. The passage filled with a dull, booming sound, and the water shoved me forward a few inches. I pulled on the stone with both hands and kicked again. My shoulders went through, then my chest. My tank dragged behind me and stopped me one more time. I could feel the creature's movement through the water. I kicked as hard as I could, and the harness tore loose. I slid into the opening. The pony bottle hit the rock but stayed in my hand. My mask scraped the limestone, and my wounded left arm burned where it caught against it. I was almost through when something closed around my ankle. I took it for a rope at first, wet and tight. Then it moved. The limb wrapped twice around my boot and pulled me backward. My knee struck the rock. The pony bottle slipped in my hand, but I caught it and pinned it to my chest before it could fall into the dark. I kicked with the other leg. The fin struck the opening, but the limb held on. I kicked again and felt the fin twist sideways. The strap pulled tight over my heel. The creature pulled harder. I couldn't back up. My shoulders were wedged through the crack and my tank was caught behind me. I couldn't turn around and I couldn't reach my ankle. There wasn't room for any of that. All I could do was kick. I kicked until my hip cramped. The limb tightened around my ankle and the edge of the fin cut into my foot. I kicked again. The fin tore away. The sudden release threw me forward. I slid out of the fissure and dropped into open water. Behind me, the creature's limbs snapped back through the gap and vanished. I didn't wait to find out if it followed. The quarry opened around me. I could feel the rock face under my left hand, and water flowed freely on both sides. There was no ceiling pressing against my tank, no broken gear, no narrow passage, just open water and the black wall dropping below me. I started up. I knew I was supposed to rise slow. I knew about controlled stops and decompression and all the other things that kept a diver from getting hurt on the way back to the surface. I knew them the same way I knew you didn't enter a cave without a line or run a tank empty in a flooded passage. Knowing something and having the time to do it are two different things. The pony bottle gave me another breath. I hauled myself upward along the rock and kicked with my remaining fin. My bare foot moved uselessly beside it. Every kick twisted my body to one side, but I kept going. The water stayed black below me. I didn't look down for long. The creature was still at the fissure. I could feel the pressure waves fading behind me and then stopping altogether. It had reached the opening. It didn't come through. I kept climbing the rock face. The air in the pony bottle was getting weaker, but it was still there. My chest hurt from holding back my breathing between each pull. I took short breaths and told myself that was better than panicking, though I don't know if I was telling myself or just trying to make the air last. The water above me changed from black to green. That meant the surface was close. Sunlight filtered down through the quarry and made a pale glow over the rock. I could see my hand now. I could see the blood still leaking from my forearm and the torn strap hanging from my ankle. I pulled harder. My ears hurt. My lungs felt tight. The pony bottle hissed against my mouth, and I took another breath from it as I kicked upward with one fin. The creature stayed below at the fissure. I broke into the green quarry water above the fissure and kicked toward the surface, with one fin missing. I broke through the surface and kept kicking toward shore, with one fin missing. The quarry water was cold on my face, but it felt warmer than the water below. I could see the gray sky now and a strip of rock along the edge. My left arm hung useless beside me.
The pony bottle was still pressed against my ribs, though I don't remember deciding to keep hold of it. There were 2 men on the shoreline. They'd been fishing from a flat patch of rock and were staring at me. One of them stood up fast.
Hey, friend, can you hear me?
I tried to answer, but only got water and a rough cough. I took the regulator out of my mouth and raised the bottle for them to see. I figured they might understand that I was a diver.
The older man was already moving toward the water. He wore a fishing cap and a faded life vest over a canvas jacket. The other man followed him. He was bigger and moved slower, but he didn't waste any steps.
Grab his arm,
The older man said.
Easy now, son.
The bigger man went in up to his knees. He reached for my right shoulder and caught hold of the strap across my chest.
Hold on, Howard's got you,
he said. I couldn't tell who Howard was. Maybe it was somebody he was talking about. Maybe the cold had gotten to my head, and I heard the name wrong. The man pulled anyway, and the older one grabbed my other arm. The rocks scraped against my knees. My torn foot dragged behind me, and the missing fin kept catching in the water. I tried to help them, but my legs weren't working right. They hauled me up onto the shoreline and rolled me onto my back.
The sky moved above me, or maybe I moved under it.
Don't move him any faster than we have to,
The bigger man said.
I'm not moving him fast.
The older man replied.
He's cold.
I was cold. That was one of the few things I knew for sure. My teeth were knocking together, and my hands had stopped feeling like hands. The cut on my forearm had opened back up, and blood ran down my wrist, mixed with quarry water and whatever was left of my glove.
The older man leaned over me.
Easy, son, we've got you. What's your name?
I tried to say Randy. It came out as air. The bigger man looked at him.
He's not answering. Get the blankets from the truck. I'll get them.
The man ran up the bank. The older one stayed with me and kept one hand against my shoulder so I wouldn't roll back toward the water. I wanted to tell him about the cave. I wanted to tell him Randy was still down there. I wanted to tell him not to let anybody go into the fissure without a line.
What came out was my brother.
Where is he?
I tried again.
Cave?
The older man nodded like those 2 words made sense. Maybe they did. There was a quarry behind us and a diver lying on the rocks with one fin and a damaged arm. A cave wasn't much of a stretch.
All right,
He said.
We'll get you warm first.
That wasn't what I needed. I grabbed his jacket with my good hand.
Randy's in there. He looked down at my hand on his jacket. Then he looked toward the quarry.
Your brother's in the water?
I nodded. The bigger man came back with a blanket and a first aid kit. They wrapped me up and pressed something against my arm. It hurt enough to bring me fully awake for a few seconds.
What happened down there?
The bigger man asked. I told them. Not all of it at once. I couldn't talk that long. I said there was a fissure beneath the quarry's rock face. I said Randy went in ahead of me. I said the passage narrowed and there was a chamber beyond it. I told them about the thing in the water.
A blind creature. The older man kept his eyes on me while I talked. The bigger one looked toward the water every now and then. Neither of them told me I was wrong.
When I finished the first time, the older man said,
Well, son, we're getting you to the clinic.
Randy's still down there.
I heard you. You've got to get him out. We'll tell them where he is. You can't just tell them. They need to go now.
The bigger man tightened the bandage around my forearm.
All right, we're getting you help first. Then we'll deal with the cave.
I wanted to argue with him, but the shoreline tipped sideways. The sky went dark at the edges, and the cold moved up through my chest. I heard the older man tell somebody to call for an ambulance. Then I heard the water. After that, there were pieces.
A ceiling with square lights. A mask over my face. Somebody cutting the rest of my dive gear away. A voice asking me to stay awake. My forearm wrapped from wrist to elbow. The pressure in my chest and ears that told me I hadn't made the ascent the way I was supposed to. They took me to the Bedford Medical Treatment Facility. I had no idea how long it took or how long I was there before I could talk again. The cold was gone by then, but my arm was still throbbing, and every breath felt like it had to pass through a narrow place. Dean and Brett were there when I woke up enough to answer questions. I learned their names from the nurse, or maybe from the men themselves. The older one was Dean. The bigger one was Brett. Dean sat near the wall with his fishing cap in his hands. Brett stood by the door.
"How you doing, son?"
Dean asked.
"Randy."
"We know,"
Brett said.
"You told us. I need somebody to go in."
Dean looked at Brett. Brett looked at the floor.
"Tell them what happened,"
Dean said.
"Tell it straight."
So I did. I told them Randy was my brother. I told them the body was inside an unsurveyed cave beneath Blackwater Quarry. I told them the creature had separated us and that I had left Randy down there. They listened. Dean didn't interrupt. Brett didn't either. Later, Andy came in wearing a county jacket over his sheriff's uniform. He pulled a chair close to the bed and set a small notebook on his knee.
"Start at the beginning, Grayson,"
he said. I started at the beginning. I told him about the fissure, the guideline, the underwater passage, and the chamber beyond it. I told him about the creature following light and vibration. I told him about the taps and how I thought Randy was alive. Andy asked questions in the same order each time. Where was the opening? How deep was the chamber? How long had Randy been underwater? Was I certain it was my brother?
"Let's keep this factual,"
he said when my voice got rough.
"I believe you were injured. I need to separate what you saw from what you concluded."
I told him the body had been wedged upright among the old gear. I told him the taps came from Randy's knife striking a tank. I told him the creature had used the sound to draw me across the shelf. Andy wrote something down.
"I'm not authorizing an unsurveyed entry,"
he said. I tried to sit up and my arm pulled against the bandage.
"Then inspect the fissure. Send divers down with a line. Send whoever you need to send."
He watched me for a moment.
"We can discuss inspecting the opening and recovering your brother,"
he said.
"but nobody goes in until we know what we're dealing with."
The rest of that day passed in pieces.
There was the medical treatment for my arm, and the cold, and the pressure in my chest. There were questions I answered more than once because people kept coming in and asking them again. There were needles, monitors, blankets, and somebody telling me to stay awake when I wasn't even sure I was asleep. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, the pressure in my ears had eased, and the bandage ran from my wrist almost to my elbow. The cut was still painful, but it wasn't bleeding through the bandage anymore. That counted as an improvement.
Andy picked me up outside the treatment facility. Roger and Cody were already in the county truck. They had their dive bags in the back and a coil of line tied down beside them. I didn't see any reason to bring the line if they weren't planning to use it, but I didn't say that.
The drive to Blackwater Quarry took less than an hour. I spent most of it looking out the window at the fields and trying not to think about what was below the water. That didn't work very well. When we got there, the sky was cloudy and the quarry was flat and gray. The water looked ordinary from the edge. That's the trouble with water. It can hide anything. A lost tire, a dropped tool, a body, or a creature that learned how to make you follow a sound. I led them around to the rock face and pointed down.
"There's the fissure,"
I said. The opening is below the surface. Randy went in there.
Andy stood with his hands in the pockets of his county jacket. He looked from the water to me and then back to the water.
"How far down?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe 30 feet. It drops off fast."
Roger and Cody got their equipment ready. Roger was the taller one and moved like he expected everything to work the way it was supposed to. Cody checked each strap twice and kept looking at the rock face.
"Let's keep this factual,"
Andy said.
"You said the entrance is below that ledge?" "Yes." "And the passage runs underneath the wall?" "That's what I told you." "I know what you told me."
Roger and Cody went into the water. They swam down together and disappeared below the surface. A line ran from the shore between them. though neither one entered the opening. They stayed outside the fissure and looked it over with their lights. I watched their bubbles rise.
The entrance was hard to see from shore. The rock shelf covered most of it, and the water was dark beneath the overhang. I knew where it was because I'd gone through it. The limestone narrowed around my tanks, and the passage turned toward the chamber. I knew what waited past the part they were looking at.
Roger came up first. Cody surfaced beside him a few seconds later. They pulled off their masks, but kept the rest of the equipment on.
There's a crack under the shelf,
Roger said.
No clear route past the entrance. There is a route,
I said.
There's an opening. That's not the same thing. I went through it. That doesn't make it a rescue route.
Cody looked at the water.
I'm not saying you didn't get through there. I'm saying nobody's mapped it, and nobody knows where it comes out. We need a rescue route before we need a rescue. Randy's down there. I understand that. No, you don't.
My voice came out rougher than I wanted.
His gear is still in the chamber. His body is still in there. You can't just look at the entrance and decide the rest of the cave doesn't exist.
Roger shook his head.
No, that doesn't follow. You were injured, you lost your air, and you found your brother dead in an overhead environment. You had blood loss and panic on top of that. I know what I saw. That sounds like narcosis,
he said.
Nitrogen narcosis, blood loss, and shock can make people connect things that aren't connected. You found a body. You got out. The creature is the part your brain supplied afterward.
I looked at him.
Those things came from the cave, not from my imagination.
Roger stayed silent for a moment. Cody studied the straps on his vest. I went back to the truck and took my gear bag from the bed. My arm hurt when I lifted it. The bag was still wet around the bottom and smelled like quarry water. I carried it back to the edge and set it on the rock. Andy watched me unzip it.
I brought something,
I said.
I reached inside and pulled out a fin. It was black once, maybe, though most of the color had been eaten away by the water and whatever had collected on the shelf. The rubber was stiff and cracked. I put it down between us and pulled out the other one. Neither fin matched my equipment. Neither belonged to Randy. Roger stared at them.
Those weren't in your report. I didn't have them when you questioned me.
Cody crouched and touched one of the straps without picking it up.
What are these? They were in the chamber, with the other gear.
Roger looked at me.
You carried those out? I carried what I could.
The mask came next. The frame was corroded and the glass had a cloudy film inside it. One strap had broken and the buckle was nearly gone. It looked like something that had been sitting at the bottom of a toolbox for 50 years. I put it beside the fins.
That was there too.
Cody didn't touch it this time.
Could be old equipment,
Roger said.
That's what I'm saying. No, you're saying it proves a creature. I'm saying it proves Randy wasn't the first diver to die in that cave.
The quarry was quiet except for the wind moving over the water. Roger looked at the mask and then at the fissure. Cody stood up slowly.
How old?
Cody asked.
I don't know. Older than Randy's gear. Some of the equipment down there looked like it had been in the cave for decades. Some divers have been reported missing around here over the years,
I said. The equipment belonged to them. I don't know which pieces belonged to who. I didn't have time to sort through it.
Andy looked at the fins.
You're saying those came from missing divers. I'm saying the cave has been taking people for a long time.
Roger rubbed a hand over his mouth. He didn't say narcosis again. Cody kept his eyes on the water. That was the first time either of them went quiet. My injuries didn't explain the fins. They didn't explain the mask. Being confused didn't put old equipment in a chamber under the quarry. Randy's death wasn't an isolated drowning, and I knew it. I knew it the same way I knew the creature had followed the light and the sound of our taps. Andy closed his notebook.
I'm not authorizing an entry. Then map it. We don't have a route to map from the surface.
Send a line down.
No. Andy, there's a body in there. I understand that, Grayson. I also have 2 divers telling me there is no surveyed route, no known exit, and no safe recovery plan.
Safe for who?
For everybody.
Roger nodded once.
We don't enter a fissure without a route out. Simple as that.
Cody looked at Andy.
I can inspect the outside again, but I'm not going into a hole nobody has mapped. That's the line.
Andy put the notebook in his jacket.
We'll document the location and review it with the county. I'm not sending anyone inside today.
It was the same answer as before, only this time nobody pretended there might be another one. Andy walked to the truck. Roger and Cody followed him after a moment. They left the fissure where it was, under the rock and below the gray water, with Randy and all the old equipment still inside.
I never went diving again after that. I kept the fins and the corroded mask in the same gear bag. I didn't return them to the families of the missing divers. I couldn't say who they belonged to, which was true, but it wasn't the whole reason. The next several days went by while I recovered from the dive and tried not to think about Blackwater Quarry. I couldn't keep my mind off it. I stayed away from the quarry, but staying away from a place doesn't mean you stop seeing it. I saw the gray water whenever I closed my eyes. I saw the fissure under the rock shelf and the dark passage beyond it. Sometimes I saw Randy's mask lying on the chamber floor. Sometimes I saw the creature. The arm took longer to heal than I expected. The cut ran deep, and the doctors had to keep changing the dressing. It hurt when I moved it, and it hurt when I didn't move it. My foot was worse for a while because of the missing fin strap and the way I'd twisted it getting through the opening, but that started improving before the arm did. I kept the salvaged equipment in the same gear bag. The bag stayed zipped up in the spare room, shoved up beside the plaster. I didn't open it after I got home. I didn't clean the fins or the mask. I didn't take them anywhere. There were people who might have recognized the equipment if I'd shown it around, families who might have been looking for something that had gone down with a missing diver, but I couldn't tell them what belonged to who. That wasn't the whole reason I kept it. The whole reason was that I didn't want to be near it. I never went below the surface again. I sold some of my equipment and gave the rest to a man who worked at a dive shop. I kept my regular mask and a few small things since I couldn't decide what else to do with them. But I never filled another tank, and I never went back underwater. I didn't even like swimming pools after that. A few months passed. I went back to work. I drove the same roads and bought groceries at the same store and did all the regular things people do when something terrible has happened and the rest of the world hasn't noticed. Nobody stopped me in the street to ask if I was all right. That was probably for the best. The bag stayed in the spare room. The first time I heard the tapping, I was awake in bed. It was late, though I couldn't say exactly how late because I'd stopped looking at the clock. The house was quiet. The furnace hadn't come on, and there wasn't any wind against the windows. Then something tapped 3 times. It came from the spare room. I sat up and listened. The sound had been dull and close, metal on metal. The intervals between them were even. I waited for another sound. Nothing happened. I got out of bed and walked down the hall. My arm had started aching again in the cold weather, and I kept it close to my side while I moved. The spare room door was open. The gear bag sat beside the wall where I'd left it. Nothing was touching it. I turned on the light. The bag was still zipped shut. The fins were inside it, along with the corroded mask and the other pieces of old equipment I'd carried out of the chamber. The room was empty. I checked the window, even though I knew it was locked. I looked under the desk and behind the old chair in the corner. There wasn't anybody there. There wasn't anything in the room that could have moved by itself. The tapping didn't happen again that night. I told myself it had been the house settling. Metal expands and contracts, pipes knock, appliances make noises when they start up. There are all kinds of sounds in a house once you pay attention to them. That explanation worked until it didn't. The tapping came back on another night. Then it came back a few nights after that. It didn't happen every night, and it never happened at the same time, but it always sounded the same. 3 taps, not 2, not 4, 3. I knew that signal. Randy and I had relied on that signal for years whenever we dove together. If one of us heard it underwater, we knew the other diver was okay. 3 taps on a tank or a rock or any piece of metal close enough to carry the sound. It was a simple signal. That's the thing about signals. They don't have to be complicated if both people already know what they mean. I tried recording it the next time, but the sound stopped as soon as I picked up my phone. I sat there with the phone in my hand and listened to the empty house. The floor was still. The walls were still. Nothing moved in the spare room. I didn't go to the quarry. I didn't need to. The cave was still beneath Blackwater Quarry, whether I stood beside it or not. Randy was still in that chamber. The fissure was still under the rock shelf, and the county had never sent anyone inside. The creature remained inside it too. I couldn't say how I knew that. I just knew. The cave hadn't been emptied. Nobody had found another way in. Nobody had recovered Randy, or the equipment, or anything else that had been left in the chamber. And the signal hadn't come from Randy. Randy couldn't be tapping from the spare room. He was dead, and I knew where he was. The sound was his signal, but it wasn't him sending it. I sat in the spare room with the bag between my feet and the light turned off. The street lamp outside put a pale stripe across the floor. I could see the shape of the bag along the wall, dark and sealed and quiet. I listened for another response. For a while, there was nothing. The house made its usual small noises. A pipe clicked somewhere behind the wall. The furnace came on and pushed warm air through the vent. I could hear a car pass on the road outside and fade away. Then the room went quiet again. The gear bag stayed where it was. I stayed in the chair and didn't touch it. 3 taps sounded against metal in my empty room, identical to Randy's signal, and nothing else moved.